Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, March 28th, 2024. My name is Emma Vigalinden for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Casey Michel on the Heritage Foundation's love affair with Viktor Orbán. And later in the show, Joel Thornton, professor of atmospheric chemistry, will be with us to discuss the troubling analysis of air quality throughout the world that just came out. Also on the program today, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights says the genocide word in her report on Israel's actions in Gaza. This comes as a new Gallup poll shows a majority of Americans, including a majority of independents, disapprove of Israel's actions. Ireland announces it will intervene and submit its own filing in support of South Africa's genocide case. New footage shows the IDF killing 2 Gazans, one waving a white flag and then burying them with a bulldozer. 2 bodies recovered, but 4 remain missing in the Baltimore bridge collapse, or Maryland, I should say. The men were construction workers, immigrants, doing the hard work to keep this country running. The Missing Migrants Project finds that 2023 was the deadliest year for migrants since they started tracking this stuff. Breaking news, Sam Bankman-Fried sentenced to 25 years in prison for $8 billion in fraud via FTX. Turns out Trump's $107 million legal bill since 2021 has been almost entirely paid by campaign donations. He's barely, paid out of pocket at all. I don't think, if at all.
I can't win if I'm in prison.
Smart.
Yes, because I'm smart. You guys are suckers. A California judge rules that Trump coup lawyer John Eastman should be disbarred. The sexual assault lawsuit against totally straight CPAC chair Matt Schlapp was dropped, coincidentally after his accuser got $500,000. The death toll in the Moscow terror attack reaches 143, and reports of Central Asian migrants in Russia facing increased violence towards them in response. Disney drops its lawsuit against Ron DeSanctimonious, who frames it as a win and is now spending his time signing bills to protect landlords. And lastly, it turns out election denier Ronna McDaniel was in talks to be on MSNBC despite Maddow's defense of the network and also common sense. All this and more on today's Majority Report. You know, I guess the other headline was that Joe Lieberman is dead, but I'm gonna talk about that in a second. I just didn't think he was worthy of really highlighting at the beginning there. He's dead. Hello to my very alive friends.
Unlike Joe Lieberman.
Joe Lieberman.
One of the arch villains of this show, even probably prior to my time, I mean, Sam would still reference him, but if you did a heat map, these references are getting less and less as Lieberman faded from, acting on a political scene and doing horrible things. And he's another guy who it would be a mistake to spend this time eulogizing him in any way or, zeroing in on him as a father or whatever. It's
irrelevant.
Exactly. As a actor, as a political decision maker, as somebody who had a lot of influence in this country, a legacy of just horror, like medical debt, wars, all that stuff.
So for on that note, Joe Lieberman is dead. For the kids out there, as Matt alluded to, if you thought Joe Manchin was bad, Joe Lieberman filled a very similar role in the Senate. But he wasn't from a red state. He was from Connecticut. And as the man who is the most responsible in the Senate for killing the public option in the Affordable Care Act, as well as, by the way, the efforts to lower the Medicare eligibility age to 55 years old, he was the one in that Democratic conservative Democrat coalition who were working to water down the ACA, who was not from a conservative state. That's what also was notable about it. Like Evan Bayh was from Indiana. Max Baucus, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee at the time, was from Nebraska, and he was a big part. Montana. I was thinking of Ben Nelson. Ben Nelson was a big part of that too. He was from Nebraska. So, they were operating in a different kind of incentive structure, but Connecticut is the insurance capital of the country, and that includes health insurance. It is a massive industry there, and Joe Lieberman was a very effective bagman for or concierge or whatever you want to call it for those financial interests. And so it was also especially just from Obama's perspective, a stab in the back, because Obama campaigned for Lieberman in 2006. And then when Obama ran for president in 2008 and won the nomination, Lieberman turned around and campaigned for John McCain. So this was like just the kind of guy that Joe Lieberman was. He represented health insurers, he represented capital, and he is largely responsible for the amount of medical debt that people experience, the fact that we don't have a public option for healthcare, the fact that your healthcare is so expensive. That is the legacy of Joe Lieberman. Another piece of his legacy is the organization No Labels, which is still floating, fielding a third-party presidential candidate because Biden is too left-wing. That is their conceit. To the center of Biden and Trump. So they're still floating this, trying to make the country worse. That is his legacy too. And, any third party that enters, there's a potential to steal votes away from Biden. And who knows how things are going to go in that election. God help us with another Trump administration. But with all that said, Lieberman was also an unrepentant cheerleader for the Iraq War. And when I say unrepentant, this is an interview that Mehdi Hasan did in 2021 with Joe Lieberman, back when Mehdi Hasan was still on the Peacock network. And Lieberman refuses to acknowledge that the Iraq War, which is universally understood to be a horrific thing that the United States did.
A big fat mistake, as former President Trump said in a Republican debate.
Killed hundreds of thousands of people, destabilized the region, gave rise to groups like ISIS, all under false pretenses of Saddam Hussein developing a nuclear weapon or weapons of mass destruction, which were weapons of mass destruction, all proven to be false. But Joe Lieberman still thinks the war was a good thing.
Shifted on the Iraq war. Before I let you go, I got to ask you about Iraq. We just saw the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the end of the Afghan war. You have someone like Chris Murphy now representing Connecticut that you sat in for the Senate. He's very critical of the Iraq war. Have you disowned it? As recently as 2015, 2016, you were still saying you thought it was a good thing overall. It was a disaster. Are you willing to say tonight it was a disaster, you were wrong, you regret it, you apologize?
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm not. I mean, look, I was in the majority of members of the Senate Democratic Caucus who voted to authorize President Bush to go to war in Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein. After the war, after Saddam went into hiding until we caught him, the Bush administration made some big mistakes. And that went to the whole way in which they handled the Iraqi military, the Iraqi government. But my point of contention with a bunch of my fellow Democrats who turned against the war then was that we can't just cut funding for our troops in battle, which is what a couple of Democrats tried to do, and I was decisive vote against. We can't leave this battlefield in defeat because it'll until we stabilize the country. And frankly, we did. That actually happened.
But hold on. I have to ask this. We're out of time, but I have to jump in here. Thousands of Iraqis died, innocent men, women, children, civilians, in U.S. airstrikes, in massacres, in places like Haditha, Mahmoudiya, Balad. I asked John Bolton this same question almost exactly a year ago on this show. Does none of that bother you? Doesn't affect your conscience? Doesn't keep you up at night? The sheer level of suffering that we caused in Iraq?
Yeah, but of course it does. But the truth is that the people of Iraq were suffering terribly under Saddam Hussein, and so were the people of the region. I think the world is safer, as your headline up there from an earlier statement of mine, without him there. The cost of the war, both in lives and in money, American money, was way beyond what I ever anticipated. So I suppose if you could have foreseen that, I might have felt differently about it, but I'm not going to go back and try to correct.
I would hope that if you had foreseen thousands of deaths, you would have thought differently about it. We'll have to leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically saying it was worth it for us to get rid of the guy that we really just didn't like for all this time. Joe Lieberman, Democrat, then independent from Connecticut.
I appreciate maybe getting him on the record just to underline a point. Not just thousands of Iraqis, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis killed because of that invasion of Iraq. Between 250,000 and 500,000.
Based on a false pretense. But I mean, in 2011, let's pull this up here, Bradley, from I found this. John Schwartz is a great account on Twitter and finds these great things here. When he was speaking to Arianna Huffington about this too, Joe Lieberman said that here we go. Arianna Huffington says, well, based on this completely unfounded assumption, I sincerely hope for the sake of the country that you do not become Secretary of Defense. This was after he said in this Morning Joe interview that I guess he was saying this in 2011, that Saddam was developing weapons of mass destruction. Saddam was developing chemical and biological weapons. This has been disproven many times over. And Arianna Huffington presses him on this, and she says, there is nothing in the report that proves anything that you have said. He said, I don't think you've read it, sweetheart.
Referring to this Dulfer report, which was commissioned by the U.S. government.
Right.
To kind of
justify the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
So, just a little bit,
I'll just underline from Wikipedia. The report acknowledged only a small stockpiles of chemical WMDs were found, the numbers being inadequate to pose a military significant threat. So that's from, just a Wikipedia summary of that report. So
Joe Lieberman is dead. That is who he was. That is his legacy. I don't care who he was as a father, a grandfather, a gardener, an amateur backgammon player, whatever the hell he was. I care about him as a public servant. Yep. And there are many, many people dead and their lives worse off because of his influence on the United States federal government.
His influence persists and still needs to be fought.
Yep. So there you go.
Oh, and the other thing is safer because of the invasion of Iraq and the quote unquote how Bush handled the Iraqi military. Yeah, ISIS, bro. We're safer. Just to name one outshoot of that conflict.
Exactly. Before we speak to Casey Michel, we have a word from our sponsors. Do you ever worry that your brain is on overdrive and your mind is constantly racing? The plans, the worries, the to-do list, they're never ending. The thinking about the horrors in the news on a constant basis, for example. Calm can help your mind take a break from all the noise by softening anxiety symptoms in the moment and helping you cope with day-to-day stressors. The Calm app puts the tools that you need to feel better in your back pocket. If you go to calm.com/majority, you'll get a special offer of 40% off a Calm premium subscription, and new content is added every week. Calm is the #1 app for sleep and meditation, giving you the power to calm your mind and change your life for the better. Calm recognizes that everyone faces unique challenges in their daily lives, that mental health needs differ from person to person, and that time for meditation may vary. And since self-practices are so deeply personal, Calm strives to provide content that caters to your preferences and needs. I mean, when I try to meditate without something like Calm, I just my mind starts to race. I have a timer set on my phone and I'm just thinking about, oh, how long is this time? How much time is left? When you have Calm, it really just forces you to sit with it, and it goes by much more quickly and you feel better afterwards. The meditations range to fit your needs each day, from anxiety and stress, relaxation and focus, to building habits and taking care of your physical well-being. They have sleep stories with hundreds of titles to choose from, including sleep meditations and calming music that will have you drifting off to dreamland quickly and naturally. They even have expert-led talks on topics such as tips for overcoming stress, anxiety, handling grief, improving self-esteem, caring for relationships, and more. Calm can help you dedicate just a few minutes each day to reducing stress, improving your focus, and increasing your overall well-being. Stress less, sleep more, and live better with Calm. For listeners of this show, Calm is offering an exclusive offer of 40% off a Calm premium subscription at calm.com/majority. Go to calm.com/majority for 40% off unlimited access to Calm's entire library. That's calm.com/majority, calm.com/majority for 40% off. And lastly, we've spoken about Aura frames before, how it's the best gift, especially when you have Mother's and Father's Day coming up. It's a simple but meaningful gift idea for your mom, your dad, a grandparent who lives across the country. A digital picture frame from Aura. It is perfect for sharing pictures of all the things that your family members may not be able to be there for, if they can't travel, or if they're far away, from family vacations to their grandkids' graduation. And so when you get this frame, you're able to load it up, you can send it, you can basically preset it. So if you're the person who's receiving this gift is a little bit older, they are all set. They just have to plug it in and they don't have to do any of the stuff that, maybe some more complicated devices require. It comes with unlimited storage and simple controls on the frame, so you can upload as many photos as you want, and mom or dad can pick the perfect one. See why it was named the #1 digital frame by Wirecutter, The Strategist, and Wired. Right now, you can save time on the perfect gift that keeps on giving by visiting auraframes.com. For a limited time, listeners can get $20 off their best-selling frame with code MAJORITY. That's auraframes.com, promo code MAJORITY. Terms and conditions apply. All right, quick break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about Viktor Orbán. We are back, and we are joined now by Casey Michel, director of the Combating Kleptocracy Program at the Human Rights Foundation, author of the upcoming book, Foreign Agents, How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. His piece in the New Republic is titled, How Viktor Orbán Conquered the Heritage Foundation. Casey, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Emma, thanks so much for having me.
So, let's start here. Who is Viktor Orbán, and what does he mean to the global right-wing project right now?
Yeah, his day job, Viktor Orbán, is the 14-year long-serving prime minister in the country of Hungary, but he is so much more than a Hungarian politician right now. He has become, over the past few years, this kind of icon, certainly in the West as well as globally, for those that like to rail against so-called wokeness, progressive policies, gender identity, sexual relations, so on and so forth. He has become kind of a lodestar and, again, an icon for what a leader, an elected leader, can do to demolish a democracy, as we have seen take place in Hungary over the past few years. And he has certainly created a model that those in the United States of America that are supporting Donald Trump would love to see play out right here in the U.S.
So would it be fair to describe him as a Christian theocrat to a degree?
There are certainly elements of that. It is not, there's not significant indication that Orban himself is any kind of overwhelming or overweening believer. He has not had any kind of fundamentalist background himself. In that sense, he's kind of similar to Donald Trump as someone who didn't arise out of the kind of evangelical far-right theocratic mix, but he has certainly turned to them as his base of support and leaned on them in terms of supporting his anti-democratic and authoritarian policies, all of which have been for their benefit.
What are the notions, I should say, of like moral traditionalism, right? That he seems to kind of promulgate as the leader of Hungary.
Yes, he pushes a lot of the same rhetoric we see certainly in the United States among those on the religious right, those evangelical supporters of Donald Trump, and certainly Donald Trump himself. These ideas of tradition and traditionalism, these ideas of returning to some kind of nuclear family, these ideas of using the state to propound policies, to actually implement policies that will encourage, again, this notion of kind of a man and a wife and a handful of children, you know, this kind of idealized version, certainly in the United States, that we saw in the 1950s, that has led to all manner of policies rolling back, again, the kind of progressive rights, progressive gains we have seen over the past few years. Again, rhetorically, it's about returning to some kind of long lost, you know, nostalgic kind of gauzy history in which Hungary was once a great country, and certainly the United States was once a so-called great country. If anything, Orban's slogan is very much "Make Hungary Great Again," and certainly that's what we've seen with Donald Trump.
It is kind of a hallmark of fascists and far-right people and far-right ideology to harken back to an imagined past. I know that Orban also is kind of a bit of a Putin fan as well. Vladimir Putin invokes this in order to justify his imperial ambitions in Ukraine. Can you speak a bit about their relationship?
Yes, absolutely. They have, by all appearances, a very close relationship, certainly closer than anything Putin has with any other leading figure in the European Union or in NATO. Again, Hungary being an EU member as well as a NATO ally of the U.S. Everything I just said about these ideas of traditionalism, these ideas of traditional masculinity, these ideas of returning a country, a state, a nation to a formerly great status once more is everything we have seen out of Moscow under Putin over the last quarter century. And it's also a reason that Putin has attracted so much support among the religious right in Europe, but especially in the United States of America as well. It is a similar, if not identical, model. Orban is not yet the dictator that we have seen take place in Moscow under Putin. He has not yet created that dictatorship. He's certainly on that trajectory. However, and again, this is all a model that Donald Trump and his base would love to see take root in the United States of America.
Yeah, I want to get to the connections to Trump and the Heritage Foundation, which is, you know, the thrust of your piece here. But to give people an even more robust sense of this ideology is really key, because you hear things about. So he's a pro-natalist politician, right? I'm wondering if you could expand on that. Elon Musk is speaking in these terms these days. Tucker Carlson is speaking in these terms these days. This just fixation on birth rates, a very specific kind of person who needs to be giving birth, very much heteronormative, and also focused on racial purity. This is central to Orban's politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you make a great point. It is not about population growth. It is certainly not about welcoming immigrant populations into whether it's Hungary or Russia or obviously the United States of America. I think Orban first crossed a lot of folks' radars outside of Hungary back in the mid-2010s when there was this immigration and refugee surge coming from especially the Middle East. And Orban took the lead, both rhetorically as well as in terms of policy, and making sure that as few as possible of those families, those children that were in need, looking for food, looking for shelter, did not find it in Hungary. Now, we see that clamp down on any kind of immigration, again, encouraging the kind of nativist, racialist approach that we've seen take place under Orban, and certainly Trump has amplified in the United States. We have seen that, as well as some of these policies you mentioned a moment ago, these nominally pro-natalist policies to encourage, again, heteronormative family structures. And frankly, at the end of the day, trying to get Hungarian women to have as many children as possible. Again, they paper it over with this rhetoric about returning the nation to greatness and simply supporting local economics. But at the end of the day, it is nothing if not pure nativism, pure racism through and through.
And he's very much in keeping with the Georgia Maloney's of Europe as well, right? And their just desire to see migrants drown in the sea.
Yeah, absolutely. You made a point a moment ago, Emma, that it harkens back. It certainly gestures at some of the traditional fascist approaches we have seen in Europe as well as elsewhere. There was a great book that came out a few months ago called America Last by an American writer named Jacob Heilbrunn, looking at traditional American support for fascist dictators abroad. And one of those being especially Benito Mussolini, the kind of fascist, the very first one, who implemented many of these same policies and used much of the same exact rhetoric in terms of the creation of Italian families, the defense of traditional masculinity, as well as, in Mussolini's head, the defense of white Christianity in and of itself. Again, we are seeing this take root in Orban, in Hungary, and elsewhere.
So I guess then it's a good opportunity then to turn to where they want to take root, this ideology wants to take root now, which is in the United States, specifically through the Heritage Foundation. You write about this in the New Republic. I'd encourage everybody to read that piece, how Orban came to the United States a few weeks ago, and he did not meet with Biden through traditional diplomatic channels, as would be appropriate for this kind of visit. He just went and met with Trump. Talk a bit about what happened there.
Yeah, this is, again, a head of state for a member of the European Union. This is a NATO ally. Other EU heads of states, other NATO allies, and those heads come to the United States of America all the time. And almost always, without fail, they go to Washington, they go to the White House, and they have a sit down with President Biden or whoever is in the White House at this time. This trip was different in a way that, frankly, I have never seen before. First, Orban went to not Washington, but down to Florida, down to Mar-a-Lago, to have a sit down with former President Trump. According to some of the footage that came out afterward, they were not only sitting down and talking about some of these common policies and certainly Trump's fandom of Orban, but apparently they attended a concert of a Beatles cover band as well. I'm not sure if that cover band knew exactly who was in the audience that day, but we'll leave that to the side. But then Orban did go to Washington. Again, a very traditional route, these foreign heads of states going to Washington. But he did not go to the White House. Apparently, he didn't meet with a single member of the American diplomatic staff. Instead, he spoke at a closed-door meeting. The photos made it seem like there were a few hundred individuals who were there. A closed-door meeting of the Heritage Foundation, which is, again, one of the leading, if not the leading, pro-Trump think tanks in Washington, and has really taken a lead in crafting the kinds of Trumpist policies they would love to see a Trump 2.0 implement should he win in November.
The only example that I can think of that is fairly recent that is analogous is when Netanyahu under Obama circumvented traditional diplomatic channels and just went and worked with the Republicans in Congress to speak to them. But that was obviously a very public thing, you know, and in the within the capacity of like Congress and outside of just it being through shady Heritage Foundation kind of more submerged power structures.
Yeah, God knows I'll be the last person on earth to defend Benjamin Netanyahu, but at the very least, when he was in Washington all those years ago, he was meeting with other congressional officials, other representative members of the U.S. Congress. Orban was not. He was simply going to Washington solely to have a sit-down conversation with the president of the Heritage Foundation, again, in front of a couple hundred members, not only of the Heritage Foundation, but according to the readout that they had, other conservative writers, other conservative activists, and other conservative policymakers. We still don't have a roster of all the individuals who were there. I would love to get my hands on that at some point, but it has been an incredibly non-transparent event and meeting. Again, we only have these kind of trickles that have come out since the Heritage Foundation did not publicly advertise it. They do not have anything on their website at last check about it. It was all very hush-hush, and we still had plenty of questions about what they actually talked about.
So, yeah, I guess, can you give, you write about how Vivek Ramaswamy was in attendance, the Heritage President Kevin Roberts was there. What do you know about this meeting?
Well, again, unfortunately, very little. We have one readout from the Hungarian side that says Orban talked about, again, many of the things that are just kind of in his wheelhouse: anti-wokeness, family policies, traditionalism, so on and so forth, that we have already discussed earlier. Again, yes, Vivek Ramaswamy apparently is still doing the circuit. I'm not sure if he's formally affiliated with Heritage or he was just in town. But again, there's a little bit of sure, it's just a matter of time. It's almost less interesting to me in terms of what the content of the actual talk was. And again, he was having to sit down with Kevin Roberts, who was appointed in 2021 as the head of the Heritage Foundation, and has taken that organization in a clearly pro-Trump, pro-Orban direction. He is, among plenty of other things, an election denier, says he didn't believe Joe Biden freely and fairly won the 2020 election. It's almost less interesting to me what they talked about, so much for what this says about not only where Hungary fits in with things like American foreign policy and where Orban fits in with the broader kind of global right, but also how it is that the Heritage Foundation has become this go-to plank for figures like this. And then even pulling back the lack of information, the clear lack of transparency about American think tanks writ large. I mean, I've been writing on the lack of clarity, the lack of transparency for funding for American think tanks for almost 10 years at this point. I've certainly never seen anything like the Hungarian, the Orban sit down at Heritage, but American think tanks for years have been opening their doors to dictatorial wealth, dictatorial donations, and funds from other authoritarian regimes. In that sense, it was simply keeping with the tradition we've seen elsewhere, but this was certainly something new, certainly something that was innovative in this space.
But the Heritage Foundation ties are not new. Can you speak a bit about the Danube Institute and its connections to the Heritage Foundation? What it is within the context of Hungarian politics, and how it has such close ties to the Heritage Foundation?
Sure, absolutely. Again, I think pulling back, we need to remember that Viktor Orbán has demolished any semblance of democracy in Hungary itself, step by step dismantling all the kind of democratic credentials in Hungary. And part of that is using state funds and state resources to direct them toward new organizations that are nominally independent, not necessarily or technically part of the government, but are still used as simply propaganda arms that are used to propagate pro-Orban rhetoric while still having the kind of veneer of independence behind them. And that is exactly what the Danube Institute is. It was formed a while back and then began receiving in recent years state funding directly or through a foundation that is solely funded by the Hungarian state. It is now little more than an arm of the Orban government and of pro-Orban propaganda itself. And not long ago, it inked a formal partnership with an American organization called the Heritage Foundation. They are now formal partners. They have, according to the Heritage spokesperson, a memorandum of understanding for joint research, joint events, joint conferences, some of which we have already seen. Certainly, the meeting in Washington seems to be an outgrowth of that meeting. But again, we have an American think tank that has gone all in on Trump, setting up a formal partnership with an organization that is purely state-funded and that is little more than a cutout for the Orban regime. Again, we have these formal linkages where they can amplify one another's messages, reach similar audiences in the U.S. and in Hungary, as well as elsewhere.
Where's Steve Bannon in all this? Because this seems very Bannon-y to me.
It's a wonderful question. I should say that Steve Bannon, I'm not aware of him being in attendance at the Heritage Foundation event. I did not see any familiar faces or that, olive green, frumpy, lumpy coat that he likes to wear in the audience today. But we do know that Orban also met with Steve Bannon when he was in the United States of America. Again, we don't have any details. We just have a kind of a half-second clip that Orban later posted to Instagram. We know there's a relationship there. And again, as you said, Emma, this absolutely reeks of something that Bannon would love to do. Again, these kind of false front organizations that are little more than cutouts, these kinds of backroom, back channel conversations, all of which allow figures like Orban to directly target American conservatives, American reactionaries, the Trump base, so on and so forth, as well as all of those potential future policymakers under a Trump administration, under a Trump 2.0. Absolutely. This has the shadow of Steve Bannon hanging all over it.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels like these are his politics, and they're winning. I mean, can you talk a little bit about what this connection represents within the context of the you wrote about it in your piece, but the very Reaganite Heritage Foundation now just kind of moving towards this global consolidation of fascist ideals, one that's fixated on kind of borders, preservation of traditional family or certain kinds of skin color, and even and using the government to perpetuate that. You alluded to it earlier, but Orban, some of his policies are about giving massive tax breaks to women who have multiple children and stay home, and you hear some of that in these new right figures, and this seems to me to be a more formal diversion from Reaganite politics towards this exact kind of vision, which Trump also represents.
Yeah, I don't even know if I would describe it as more formal. That's maybe underselling it at this point. As far as I'm concerned, this is a clear break with what the Heritage Foundation once was, and again, came to prominence in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. Very much a transatlantic, very much national security first, certainly very pro-NATO as well, and certainly at the time anti-Soviet, and even certainly before the recent shift, anti-Putin. That has all gone out the window. They are all in on anti-democratic authoritarian policies. They are all in on being, for lack of a better term, the brain trust of a Trump 2.0 administration. I think I used in the article the term intellectual, and I had actually one of my contacts who's on the conservative side. He's not a Trump supporter, but he reached out and said, you can't use the word intellectual about these people whatsoever. This is pure anti-intellectual rot through and through. And if nothing else, this is what Orban represents. This is the model that the Steve Bannons of the world and the Donald Trumps as well and his base of the world would like to see implemented in the United States of America. It is a dismantling of democratic credentials. It is an undermining and undercutting of American democracy writ large. And again, going back to the Reagan precedent, it is a doing away with this notion that government needs to be small, government needs to be out of the way.
Yeah.
What was the Grover Norquist quote? Government's so small you could drown it in a bathtub. Those days are gone. It is now about using the powers of the state to target your enemies, to clamp down on any and all opposition, to again create the kind of demographic base you would like to see. Deporting as many immigrants as possible and encouraging white Christian nativist birth rates. All in the hope of creating, again, this kind of nostalgic image of what your country once was. It may fall short of fascism, but that is certainly the direction it is going in.
And as we begin to wrap up here, you mentioned Project 2025 in your piece. How does this vision fit into Project 2025, which is basically this pre-vetting process for a future Trump officials if he were to win in November? That basically says it's a loyalty test, but also a test of are you a part of this kind of new far right ideology, basically.
This is what's so unsettling about the Orban meeting with the Heritage Foundation, and beyond that, what the Heritage Foundation has become over the past few years. When Trump was first elected back in 2016 and then entered office 2017, he did not have the kind of, again, to use the term I just undercut a moment ago, intellectual architecture to bring with him to staff out the administration to implement many of the policies he talked about on the stump. There were plenty of disappointments in terms of the Trump administration itself, in terms of what Trump promised on the campaign trail. That, again, is all gone almost entirely thanks to the Heritage Foundation building out the kind of immediate policy recommendations that can be implemented on day one or within the first month or within the first 100 days. Again, whether that's deporting migrants, whether that's clamping down on opposition, whether that's using things like the Insurrection Act to target protesters who may emerge after a Trump reentry into the White House. It is across the board immediate targeting of the kind of rights that Americans have enjoyed for decades, for certain parts of the U.S. for centuries at this point, from day one. It is about identifying personnel. It is about identifying policies, and it's about identifying opportunities that Trump can immediately use to his advantage, to his base's advantage, as he takes the United States of America on this march toward authoritarianism. It's called Project 2025, and this partnership with Orban is, frankly, it's just building out what they've already talked about. And at this point, when Trump gets into office, if he wins in November, it'll be just the beginning.
Last question, because I meant to hit on this earlier. how does the Islamophobia of Orban play into this? Because, I mean, I'm just trying to, like, there are a lot of strongmen in this world right now that are explicitly anti-Muslim. And I think also of Modi in India as another example. Netanyahu, I mean, it's quite clear.
Sure,
But Trump as well, some of the conspiracy theories he spread about Muslims celebrating on 9/11, of course, everything with the travel ban. Being really rabidly anti-Muslim seems to be quite a through line as well.
Oh, absolutely it is. And, fortunately or otherwise, the United States of America and certainly its leaders, especially in the Republican Party, they don't need to look to Orban for encouragement of Islamophobic rhetoric. Obviously, this is something we have seen in the United States of America for at least the last 22, 23 years, if not longer. Again, I think it's worth reminding folks that Trump rose to political prominence through his birther conspiracies, his racist conspiracies about former President Obama, saying he may have been born elsewhere, and of course that he was potentially a secret Muslim as well. But I think, Emma, that's a great point that tethers so many of these strongmen, so many of these nativists together, whether it's Modi in India, whether it's Orban in Hungary, whether it's folks like Marine Le Pen in France, and other potential vectors for future authoritarian influence and positions of power in the West. I unfortunately suspect this is going to be with us for a very long time. But again, we have this mutual reinforcement between Trump and Orban that they would love to see how far they can take it.
Well, Casey Michel, director of the Combating Kleptocracy Program at the Human Rights Foundation, the book Foreign Agents, How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World is coming out soon. When is it coming out, Casey? We should have you back.
Thanks so much, Emma. I would love to be back. It comes out in August 27th. We'll have plenty more on how authoritarian regimes are using Americans, sometimes perfectly willing Americans, to do their dirty work right here in the United States.
All right. Well, we'll put a note, and in the summer, we'll reach back out. Thanks so much, Casey. We'll put a link to your piece in the New Republic in the description wherever people are listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm.
Great. Thanks, Emma.
All right, guys, quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about some scary climate change stuff. We are back, and we are joined now by Joel Thornton, professor of atmospheric science at the University of Washington, here to talk about the latest report on air quality throughout the globe. Joel, thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
So there was this new report from IQ Air, which is this Swiss air quality organization, but they are, I mean, can you tell us what IQ Air is and kind of, I guess, why their findings are so significant?
So their IQ Air is a company that sells a range of products, one to measure air quality, but also filtration devices to improve air quality indoors and prevent exposure to air pollution. And so as part of that effort, in their business, I think they are interested in making sure there's awareness around the issue of air pollution. And so they have been creating these reports which harness data from both sort of traditional government sensors that are deployed around the world in various countries for monitoring air pollution, as well as the private low-cost sensors, they're often called. These are like purple air sensors that you can purchase online, or you can purchase one from IQ Air and put it outside your house, and then have a monitor of what air pollution is nearby your own location. And so these are often then connected to the internet, and the data can be grabbed by anyone. And that's what IQ Air is doing, is sort of collecting all of this data and then analyzing that data into this report. And they work with government agencies around the world as well to obtain the data, which is not always easy to obtain directly from websites. And then sorry, go ahead.
No, just to clarify, so even though there's a profit incentive for them, this is governmental data, and we don't need to be skeptical.
Some is governmental data, but some are just from these sensors that people have purchased and put on at their home, and the data gets streamed to a website, and then that can be collected. So there is some need for skepticism around some of the, just in part because these sensors are not going to be curated or properly calibrated necessarily, and some will have various quality, and I'm not going to sort of disparage any particular company's devices, but skepticism is definitely required for especially individual sensors that you might go see on their website, like the IQ Air is sort of posting all of the sensor data at in real time. And it's helpful to be able to see that, and because many of these devices do work reasonably well to give you a broad picture of what air pollution is like in any particular area. But if you try to focus in on one particular sensor, you may run into trouble for sure. And so in some cases, they are using data from one sensor to sort of describe what air pollution is in a particular location, and that can be problematic.
Okay, that's great context. I appreciate that. Because it wasn't necessarily immediately clear that it was a for-profit company in a lot of these articles about the findings. But it seems, though, that the findings can still be, they're still very much in keeping, I would say, from other reports that I have heard about declining air quality standards globally. I mean, as a professor of atmospheric science, what have the past few years been like in terms of global air quality? And if you could describe that within the context of the traditional standard, which is the WHO standard of measurement.
Right. So it's sort of two-sided problem where in many regions of the world, advances are being made because of regulations imposed on industry, and energy production and so on, that pollution has been decreasing. And that's certainly the case in the United States, North America, Europe, China, India. There are improvements to air quality in many of these regions, especially from pollution that was directly driven by human activities, so related to transportation, to driving your car, or energy production like coal-fired power plants. The regulations have been getting tighter and tighter, and so air pollution has actually been decreasing in many of these areas. The problem over the past few years has been wildfires, especially in North America, but also throughout the world. Both sometimes intentional burning, but also wildfires, especially in North America, have grown in frequency and severity. And in many places, this is actually wiping out the improvements that have been made through regulations that are tightening emissions from other sectors that we can control. And so in some ways, things are improving and also getting worse at the same time. And there's this intersection with climate change because as the Earth is warming from increasing carbon dioxide, this is basically driving ecosystems to be more drought stressed more often, and or for longer periods, priming them for when they do burn, for more energetic and larger burns and longer burning seasons. And this is then increasing the amount of particulate pollution, but also other types of pollutants into the atmosphere in very large quantities in very short time periods. And so you end up getting these very extreme events of degraded air quality, like was experienced throughout the US and Canada, for example, this past year. And that event actually led to a lot of what was in the report. The findings of the report for where some of the regions had the worst air quality was often driven by these wildfires.
So yeah, if you could speak a bit about that, the effect that these wildfires, if over the summer, had on 2023 air quality levels in North America. We're here in Brooklyn. We all remember walking around wearing masks. It was a little bit different for us, which I know people in the western part of the United States, it's a little bit more quotidian. But for us, it was a scary event and something that I hadn't necessarily experienced yet. What were the results? What did the science show that these wildfires had on air quality in North America?
So it was, by any measure, an extreme event compared to the past 2 or 3 decades of monitoring of air pollution, especially on the East Coast. As you mentioned, the Western states are a little bit more used to, unfortunately, having to experience wildfire smoke inundating urban areas. And the statistics show that in the Western United States, in fact, the trend has been declining air pollution, but now in the past 10 years, that's actually flattened out and in some cases started to increase again. And that's being attributed to increased wildfire frequency and severity. It was a somewhat unique event that impacted the East Coast, that wildfire smoke can be transported and has been transported in years past all the way across from the Western United States or Northern Canada into the East Coast. But the size and the intensity of the fire, so the area burned and the amount of material put into the atmosphere from the Canadian wildfires was factor 10 more than typical. And so that's partly why it was such an extreme event for this particular year. Wildfire smoke does propagate, every year from where the fires are, usually in the Mountain West, to different parts of the U.S. It's just that the levels tend to be lower and less discernible to us when we're out and about. But the extreme burning that happened in Canada this summer was obviously, you couldn't ignore it. The skies turned this bleak orange-gray during the daytime, and you could smell it. You could smell the smoke, and you didn't need an air pollution monitor that worked very well to tell you that it was really dirty air. And so these, just to give you an example, the typical particulate matter concentration in New York City would be on the order of 10 to 20 micrograms per cubic meter, but there were days, several days in a row, where it was 200 or above. So factors of 10 higher, and levels that just hadn't been seen in decades in these regions of the East Coast. In the 1970s and 60s and 50s, actually probably were often at those levels. And so that just shows you the dramatic improvements that have been made in regulating and improving air quality over time by enacting all of these different regulatory controls. We have actually made the air cleaner. It's just that with now this onset of more frequent and larger wildfires, some of that progress is being eroded.
And I mean, the root cause of these wildfires is obviously increase in heated climate, right? Climate change. The fact that
there's many factors, yeah.
Right.
So climate change is definitely one. It primes the system for more severe burning. It tends to have warmer temperatures, and then the fuels dry out faster, and so they're just ready to burn. But then there's, of course, human encroachment and changing fire suppression practices over time that have sort of all culminated to this period of just being in a situation ripe for large wildfires.
And is this, I know that there were massive wildfires in Europe as well. What were some of the effects that they experienced?
Yeah, it's, again, climate change is a global problem, and so are practices related to fire suppression and encroachment on ecosystems. There's also intentional burning that we could even talk about for the people of Brazil or Africa, where large-scale burning is done to clear land for agriculture, and that's equally a problem for exposure to particulate matter as well. Whereas wildfires are more not intentionally caused, or they're caused by a lightning strike, and then the system just erupts into fire. and they sort of can't be controlled or regulated. In Europe, so the fires in Greece, for example, were catastrophic, and that smoke has the same impact. No matter where it's produced, it's going to degrade air quality and be transported to downwind regions in Europe. And then those were all components of increasing in air pollution and degrading air quality that the IQ Air report sort of alluded to, that there was actually air pollution was not really improving at a rate that we would like between the past year, 2022 and 2023, in part because of these wildfires that were happening, not just in North America, but really across Europe and Eurasia.
What are some of the health effects from people being exposed to air that has particulate matter in it due to wildfires?
So the health effects of specific types of particulate matter are not as well understood as just exposure to particulate matter generally. And so that's a sort of active research area, is trying to understand which types of particulate matter are the most problematic for health. But in general, there's sort of two ways to think about the health effects. One is the short-term sort of acute response to breathing in highly polluted air with particulate matter. These tend to be associated with respiratory problems, inducing asthma attacks, or even inducing cardiovascular, so heart problems, and then increasing hospitalization as a result, and even can go into cardiac arrest and death. So certainly sensitive individuals that already sort of have asthma or emphysema, they're going to experience the effects earlier than someone without those conditions. But we're all sort of going to experience them. The higher the particulate matter concentrations are, you might start to feel your throat being irritated, coughing a lot more, and those are the conditions that sort of are acute and sort of in the short term. And then there's the more chronic long-term exposure to particulate matter, where much lower concentrations of particulate matter have been observed to, over the long term, to lead to negative health outcomes, especially premature death is the one that's most commonly found. So when you take into account all the other risk factors, there's an amazingly linear correlation between risk of premature death and exposure to particulate matter. So the amount that you're exposed to increases your risk of premature death by a few percent every 10 micrograms per cubic meter that you're exposed to over many years. And so there's been really some fascinating studies that compare different cities and the same cities over time as the pollution is changing over time, and in finding this strong relationship between exposure to particulate matter and premature death. And the causes of death are usually related to cardiovascular disease, so respiratory effects as well, and then lung cancer, for example. Things that are actually somewhat fascinating and disturbing is that cognitive function is now related to, so declining cognitive function is now related to exposure to particulate matter, early onset dementia. So students do poorly on tests under polluted conditions compared to cleaner conditions. And this is specifically just exposure to particulate matter. There's a type of particulate matter ultrafine. So we talk about PM 2.5. These are particles that are smaller than 2.5 microns. You might not know what 2.5 microns looks like. The cross section of a human hair, if you measure the diameter of your hair, that's about 50 to 100 microns. So we're talking about very small particles. And you get down into 100 nanometers or smaller particles. These can actually cross into the bloodstream and actually enter the brain through the olfactory nerves. And so there's now concerns that exposure to ultrafine particles are partly responsible for especially degradation in cognitive function. And I think we're really just scratching the surface in terms of what the full health impacts are of exposure to particulate matter.
That is very well said and helpful to understand. When I see numbers like 7 to 8 million people die every year due to air pollution, what is your assessment of those figures?
So those are based on these epidemiological studies where they have found relationships between the risk of premature death, so the mortality rate ratio. So this is how often death is occurring when you take into account all of the other factors that's correlated with exposure to particulate matter. And so taking then these types of measurements that the IQ Air report provides in terms of amount of particulate matter in any region and the number of years that people living in those regions are exposed to those concentrations, then they can estimate the number of premature deaths per year. And so it's a pretty strong foundation of science that those numbers are based on. So they're probably pretty reasonable. The numbers you might hear vary in part due to whether or not it's premature death due to exposure to particulate matter or to other toxic gases like ozone, or the combination of the two. And so all of them have slightly different impacts on life expectancy. And so you might hear 3 to 4 million per year die premature deaths due to exposure to particulate matter. And the 7 to 8 million is more the sort of full combined effects of air pollution are leading to 7 to 8 million deaths per year around the world. And that's just, taking these sort of rates of premature death that can be attributed to pollutants like particulate matter from long-term cohort studies, they're called, following people through time and monitoring their exposure to particulate matter or other pollutants, and then documenting when they die and what they died of, and seeing what the causality they can impart to particulate matter. And that's been done since the 1990s, those types of studies. And each study always comes back with a confirmation that particulate matter exposure leads to premature death.
And are these deaths more highly concentrated in the global south or in regions where there's, less wealth, less regulation, that kind of thing?
Right. It's really going to be where particulate matter concentrations are highest. And certainly in regions where the regulations are not enforced or not as strict, or the economy is not such that there's higher efficiency sources of fuel or filtration, then exposure will be higher. And especially in developing world nations and communities, often indoor air quality is just as bad or worse because of the way that home heating occurs or cooking is taking place. You don't have fancy hoods to try to move all of the particulate matter out of the household when they're burning over an open wood stove, and so that type of exposure is factored into some of these studies, but it's important to start, I think in the future, start separating, is it air pollution from motor vehicles, energy production like coal-fired power plants, or exposure indoors that is related to residential living and the needs of eating and heating one's own household. And so there's been large efforts to help improve those situations by providing clean cooking stoves and or more efficient home heating units in these developing world nations to better improve air quality in the homes, as well as obviously what is done in the homes often ends up in the air. And so it's this sort of combination of just inefficient burning often. And that can be for heating, cooking, or waste removal. These end up in very populated countries or regions being the biggest sources of exposure to pollution. And yes, so when the particulate matter concentrations are highest, that's where we're going to expect the highest rates of premature death.
Well, Joel, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain this to us, Professor of Atmospheric Science at University of Washington. Really appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
All right, guys. With that, we're going to wrap up the free part of this show. Head into the fun half. The number is 646-257-3920. Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Left Reckoning, we had Ben Case on to talk about why objectively what's happening in Gaza, what Israel's doing in Gaza, to use a more active formulation, is a colonial massacre just by the pre-existing criteria. And if you want to know how you can arrive at that conclusion objectively, not only with author Ben Case of the study, who is good politics, but also a co-author who's deals with like a Pentagon-aligned think tank. So this is very if you I would like it if we could just persuade people with our takes on YouTube, but some people need more. They don't trust us lefty opinion mongers. So an objective look at what sort of conflicts, what kind of criteria we can apply to conflicts. Yeah, again, a colonial massacre is what we are watching.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it is. I don't know what people need to see at this point, but I mean, maybe people need that, the historical context, the very clear definition. I mean, international law experts are also saying these kinds of things fairly straightforwardly from the definitions.
I mean, certainly, I don't think people are being more snowed in. I think more and more people are realizing what's happening. I think it's just like the pace of that is not fast enough to save tens of thousands of lives.
Yep. On ESPN, Bradley and I spoke a bit about the Kim Mulkey controversy. Has the article come out yet? Maybe her threats of legal action are spooking the Washington Post a little bit. We talked a bit about March Madness, as well as the hip drop tackle ban, and my assessment of the NHL playoff race. YouTube.com/ESPN show. We will soon be joined by Matt Binder, and that's it? ? I think Brandon can't make it.
European things to do.
Yeah, and he also has a day job, so that's part of it as well. All right, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now. And I don't think it's going to be the same as it looks like in 6 months from now. And I don't know if it's necessarily going to be better 6 months from now than it is 3 months from now. But I think around 18 months out, we're going to look back and go like, wow. What? What is that going on? It's nuts. Wait a second. Hold on for a second.
The Majority Report.
Emma, welcome to the program.
Hey.
Matt.
What is up, everyone?
Nomi Key.
You did it. Let's go, Brandon.
Let's go, Brandon.
Bradley, you want to say hello?
Sorry to disappoint everyone. I'm just a random guy.
It's all the boys today.
Fundamentally false.
No, I'm sorry. Women's...
Stop talking for a second. Now let me finish.
Where is this coming from, dude?
But dude, you want to smoke this 7A?
Yes.
Hi, me? Is it?
Yes.
Is this me?
Is it me?
It is you.
Is this me? Hello, is this me?
I think it is you. Who is you? No sound. Every single freaking day. What's on your mind?
Sports.
We can discuss free markets and we can discuss capitalism.
I'm going to go start watching.
Libertarians. They're so stupid, though. Common sense says, of course.
Gobbledygook.
We fucking nailed him.
So what's 79 plus 21?
Challenge Matt.
I'm positively quivering. I believe 96, I want to say.
857-210-35-501. 1/2. 3/8.
9/11, for instance.
$3,400, $1,900.
6, 5, 4, $3 trillion sold. It's a zero-sum game.
Actually, you're making me think less of it.
But let me say this. Poop.
You can call it satire. Sam goes, it's satire.
On top of it all, my favorite part about you is just like every day, all day, like everything you do.
Without a doubt. Hey, buddy, we see you. All right, folks.
It's just the weak being weeded out, obviously.
Yeah, sun's out, guns out. I don't know.
But you should know.
People just don't like to entertain ideas anymore.
I have a question. Who cares?
Our chat is enabled, folks.
I love it.
I do love that.
Look, gotta jump. Gotta be quick. I gotta jump.
I'm losing it, bro.
2 o'clock. We're already late, and the guy's being a dick. So screw him. Sent to a gulag?
Outrageous.
Like, What is wrong with you?
Love you. Bye.
Love you. Bye-bye.
Back.
We are back, and we are joined by...
You get the two shot here, 1 second. Binder.
Bye.
Sorry, I got to... sorry, Matt, I got to re-up.
Big tech is in bed with big con.
Why he's not showing up?
All right, well, we're figuring it out.
Yeah, they're having a weird OBS thing.
Okay, yeah, go for it. Yeah, doomed and scam economy. What could you...
Yep.
There he is.
There he is.
We should try a 3-shot.
Okay.
No.
I'll work on that.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah, about 2:15.
Can we go for a 4? Do we have a fourth camera? Can you set that up really quick, Matt?
Yeah. No, Matt just doesn't want to.
I'm not bashful. It's just a technical issue.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay,
Sure.
it's all good.
So what's going on scam economy? What's in the news?
Yeah, I don't know what we could possibly talk about. There isn't a new scam economy yet because the news that Emma is referring to just broke today, and we'll be talking about it on this show shortly, and I'll be going more in depth on scam economy in the coming week or two. But this week I did have a new episode of Doomed, which you can check out at youtube.com/MattBinder, where I walked through 2 cases this week that to me perfectly put on a little bow, like just perfectly wrapped and put a little bow on it, showcase how Elon Musk has a very interesting definition of free speech. One case is the lawsuit that was dismissed, where they tried to silence the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is a nonprofit that tracks hate speech. They didn't like a report they put out about hate speech on X, so they sued them. And then a second case, which I actually find to be so much more hypocritical and hilarious. This week, X and Elon Musk announced that they were going to fund a Canadian physician's $300,000 in legal fees that she was facing because during the COVID pandemic early in the COVID pandemic, I should say, in 2020, she had tweeted her views that were COVID vaccine skeptic and anti-lockdown. And so she was involved in a lawsuit and she lost and has to pay $300,000. So X and Musk and company are stepping in to help fund that. But they left out one little thing that I don't think a lot of people realized, and I looked into it. The lawsuit that she lost was actually filed by her. The Canadian physician, the anti-COVID vaccine Canadian physician, filed a lawsuit against 23 of her critics to silence them, to shut down their critiques. And she lost and had to pay their legal fees. So, to support free speech, Elon Musk is supporting her attempt to silence her critics. Whew. So youtube.com/MattBinder.
And I would just say, doing slap lawsuits is maybe the threat to free speech that I am most threatened by. I mean, just personally, maybe self-interestedly, but I saw what happened to Gawker because of reporting they did that got on the wrong side of Peter Thiel. And that, more than moderation of racists and anti-trans people, is the threat to free speech. And thankfully in America we have a freedom of First Amendment that protects us, compared to the UK, where there was a case where Simon Singh got sued by chiropractors for talking about how a lot of that was flim-flam. So the slap lawsuits which are strategic lawsuits against public participation, I learned on Aaron Brown's show. They're an absolute menace. And for a guy to be portraying himself as a champion of free speech, it's just it's a dark attack by a really powerful guy.
Yep.